So one of the central questions that comes up in talking about international law is how is international law actually enforced, right? There isn't an international prison system or a court system quite the way that we have in domestic context, but that doesn't mean that there's not an international enforcement system in place. And we'll talk about this in two parts today. We'll talk about enforcement through the UN system, and then later we'll talk about enforcement through human rights courts. So a foundational question is, why would states comply with international law given that there's not really enforcement the way that we see in a domestic context? And the basic answer is that international law is followed because international law is practical, right? This is something that was negotiated by states. They came up with these rules because the rules are what they want to see. And it helps them to coordinate. It helps them to solve problems. It helps them to avoid planes getting shot down when they're flying across international borders. And following international law leave states better off than they would be if they just sort of tried to do everything on their own without coordinating and working with each other. And so states could learn through repeated interaction that we follow rules because rules work and it's profitable and it makes sense. Additionally, states follow rules because they're legitimate, right? They see themselves as rule followers, that there are people who are tasked within government to, check what international law says and figure out if a state's in compliance. And if a state's not in compliance, you figure out how to get in compliance, right? That's an actual job that people do, and therefore states follow the international law. And then lastly, international law is followed because this mix of identities and values and mild coercion. I oftentimes use the metaphor about why do you wear your seatbelt? In theory, there's a law in my state of North Dakota that says I'm supposed to wear my seatbelt, but I've never been pulled over for not wearing my seatbelt. When I drive my truck, I don't wear my seatbelt. It's a 1994 Ford Ranger, and when I don't buckle my seatbelt, nothing happens. But when I drive my minivan and I don't buckle my seatbelt, it dings at me. And I'm going to, get annoyed with the dinging after a while, and I'm going to buckle up. And when I have my children in the back seat, I will buckle up not because the dinging is going on, but because I want to set a good example for them. That's what being a responsible parent means. And when my wife is in the car, I put the seatbelt on because otherwise she gives me the side eye and it drives her bonkers when I don't wear my seatbelt. And so I'm wearing my seatbelt not just because seatbelts keep me safe and it's a good thing to do. I'm wearing my seatbelt for a variety of these other reasons that have nothing to do with whether or not law enforcement is going to pull me over and write me a ticket or throw me in jail. So I think that that's maybe a useful way to think about why do people follow rules at all. And so we have a couple different reporting or a couple different enforcement mechanisms that can help to sort of reinforce that. So one of these is reciprocity, right? And there's rules built into a lot of treaties that say you have to follow this, but you only have to follow it if other people are following it. So it might be a trade agreement that says you have to reduce your tariffs, but if somebody else is willing to is not reducing their tariffs and raises their tariffs or puts restrictions on your goods, you can counter. Like you can respond with tariffs of your own or restrictions on their goods, and therefore states learn that if I play by the rules, others will play by the rules, and if I don't, they won't, and the whole thing breaks down. Right? So that can work really well as a mechanism to sort of keep states on track, knowing that if they diverge, the whole agreement will collapse because other people will stop cooperating. But then there's also reporting. And this is sort of like that dinging of the alarm in my van telling me buckle your seatbelt. So states are oftentimes required with international agreements to file a report outlining their efforts and outlining that they're in compliance. And the report goes on a website somewhere. Maybe it'll be self-reporting, like I wrote that report myself and it gets put on the website, or maybe it's peer reporting, right? Maybe there's some sort of round robin trading system of responsibility where Sweden reports on the US one year and then the US reports on Senegal the next year, and it goes around and everybody's getting reported on by somebody else, and they can say, oh yeah, well, we asked for these documents and the country was very forthcoming and gave us everything we wanted, or we tried to get this report and they were very shady about how they were behaving and we suspect that maybe they're hiding something. And again, that's up on the internet, right? Somebody is saying negative things about you up on the internet. Somebody is suggesting that you're not in compliance up on the internet. And you would think that that wouldn't have an effect. And yet it does. And it's partly just that idea of being called out by your peers and being recognized by your peers as being not in compliance. And it's partly the effort of going through the actions of filing the report where you discover, oh, well, we thought we were in compliance, but maybe we aren't. Maybe we need to adjust this for next year so that we get a better score on a report that's going up on the internet. Right? That's not flashy. That's not, police sirens and enforcement in that sort of a sense, but it does work, and it does work to keep states more or less honest and in compliance with international law. There's also an enforcement system that's built into the United Nations, and within the United Nations, there is a chapter of the UN Charter called Chapter 7, which lays out the powers of the Security Council to enforce international peace and stability. And so the UN Security Council can impose sanctions under Chapter 7. It can use military force against states to ensure compliance. In fact, they can call upon states to contribute resources to conduct military operations against other states to ensure compliance with international law and peace and stability. And Chapter 7 powers are binding on all states. So when the Security Council acts using Chapter 7, states are required by international law to comply. That having been said, strong Chapter 7 action is pretty rare. And I want to kind of give an example of this here in a second. But before we do that, I want to highlight that there's also Chapter 8. There are regional organizations which can be recognized by the United Nations system as playing a role in contributing to international peace and stability. And that a lot of cooperation takes place through these regional organizations where maybe there's interconnections among actors, whether it's the European Union, whether it's the African Union, or ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. There's these sort of networks of regionally connected states that can help keep each other on track and may act in conjunction with the Security Council to carry out Chapter 7 powers. So I believe the peacekeeping operations in South Sudan are, actually take that back, in Darfur, are being carried out by African Union soldiers, and they're gaining their authorization for those missions from the Security Council. But I want to circle back to this idea of Chapter 7 powers and this really awesome power that is invested in the United Nations Security Council to get a sense of how it's actually used in practice. And so this is a resolution that was adopted back in 2008 by the Security Council dealing with piracy off the coast of Somalia. I'm not going to show you everything, but I want to give you a sense of what these resolutions look like. And so the Security Council, recalling its past resolutions, then there's these different paragraphs. And each paragraph begins with a preambulatory clause, right? There's these little italicized phrases or words that sort of set the stage, right? So they're gravely concerned, right? What's the problem? They're going to note, noting with concern, highlighting other things that are happening, reaffirming, right? So they're referring back to other things that they've said and saying, yes, we still say these things. Other past agreements in international law is still being supported by this. Commending, right? We're going to pat somebody on the back. Noting recent humanitarian reports, right? We're drawing context. So all this is sort of the setup. Nothing in this preambulatory piece is binding, but it's telling the story. Then we get to what are called operative clauses. The sort of second section, operative clauses don't just have this sort of italicized phrase, they have numbers that go along with them. So these are the itemized things that the UN Security Council is declaring. And it's acting under Chapter 7. So they are explicitly invoking the powers that the UN Charter gives to the Security Council to require states to take action to act with the force of international law. So they begin by reiterating their condemning and deploring piracy and armed robbery at sea. So, okay, I think we're all on board with that. Calls upon states interested in security of maritime activities to take part actively in the fight against piracy. So they're not demanding that Italy send 5 ships. They're not demanding that India participate with an aircraft carrier. They're calling upon, in a general sense, states to participate. calls upon states whose naval vessels and military craft operate in the high seas and airspace off the coast of Somalia to act in conformity with international law for the repression of active piracy. Again, not demanding a specific action, but creating a space for other states to act with the sort of legitimacy of the Security Council behind them. Urges states that have the capacity to do so to cooperate. So we're not demanding, we're not ordering, we're urging states to cooperate and participate, and urges states and regional organizations, again, the African Union is referenced here subtly, in conformity with the provisions under past resolutions, to continue to take action to protect world trade lanes. All right, so again, we're not demanding, we're not ordering, we are urging, we are calling upon, we are reiterating and condemning and deploring. These are all things that don't step overtly on the toes of sovereign states, but still allow for sovereign states to work together and cooperate with the sort of legitimizing activity of this UN resolution or Security Council resolution. So the UN Security Council has these really awesome powers written in the charter, but in practice, the way that they get used is much more subtle. And in fact, I'd go a step further and suggest that the UN Charter really discourages, in the way that it's written, the Security Council from using Chapter 7 powers in a blunt sort of way. And the UN Charter has a progression of tools that are sort of laid out for how the Security Council is supposed to deal with crises and challenges and breaches of international peace and stability. And so the place that the UN Security Council is supposed to start is with Chapter 6 powers, right? So not Chapter 7, powers of the Security Council, but Chapter 6, which refers to how states can resolve their differences in a way that's fully respectful of sovereignty. They can use negotiation, right? They can bring in a mediator, they can go to the International Court of Justice, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Those are all things that states can do to resolve their differences in a way that fully affirms sovereignty and doesn't involve the UN Security Council stepping on toes and brandishing its powers in a cavalier way. So that's where you start. Then Chapter 7 powers kick in, that once you have demonstrated that you have exhausted the options and the availability of Chapter 6 tools, right? Once you have worked through those and shown this is not going to work, then you can start invoking Chapter 7 powers related to economic sanctions and disrupting communication links. And only after you've shown that those tools don't work, right? Once you reach that point, only then can you invoke Chapter 7 powers to authorize military force. And so again, this is sort of referring back to some of the ideas we talked about with just war, that war should be conducted only as a last resort. Well, that's built in here to the UN Charter, that there's this progression of tools, and that by the time you reach a point where the UN Security Council is authorizing military force, there should be a decade or two of a track record of trying to establish, through negotiation, mediation, and international courts, and through economic and sanctions and communication sanctions, that none of that's going to work, that you're not going to be able to get a state to change their behavior with anything short of military force. And then, and only then, does the UN Charter give the Security Council the power to authorize military force. So that's sort of what's built in. There's a slight wrinkle on that during the Arab Spring. The UN Security Council authorized military action in Libya using Chapter 7 powers. And part of the justification for expediting that process was that events on the ground were moving so rapidly, that the Gaddafi regime was actively engaged in a brutal suppression of the civilian population, and that if you spend 20 years using negotiation and mediation and the International Court of Justice to try to get that to resolve, the civilian population is going to be destroyed. And so there was an argument that given the rapid pace of events on the ground, that normal timeline got compressed pretty significantly. And I think that that's always been the case, but getting consensus on action has been the much bigger challenge within the Security Council, of getting those 5 permanent members, the United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France, to all back robust action has been really difficult to do given the politics of the international system.